Israeli forces have surrounded Gaza City on 3 sides and they are operating inside the city, fighting in close quarters, with the Israeli army spokesperson saying a ceasefire, quote-unquote, is not on the table at all. According to Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson, army is maintaining high readiness on all fronts and Israel's ground troops have continued advancing towards Gaza City and as diplomatic efforts intensified for at least a brief pause in the fighting.
לוחמי צה"ל השלימו את כיתור העיר עזה, המוקד של ארגון הטרור חמאס. בשעות האחרונות, כוחות שריון וחי"ר, בסיוע כלי טיס רבים של חיל האוויר, תוקפים מוצבים, מפקדות, עמדות שיגור ותשתיות טרור נוספות המשמשות את הנהגת חמאס ואת המחבלים שלה.
Now, as per Chief of Israel's military engineers, militant group Hamas has learned and prepared itself well. Israeli army is encountering mines and booby traps, and Hamas and other militant organizations are using guerrilla warfare tactics. They are emerging from tunnels to fire at tanks and then disappearing back into the network. The city in the north of Gaza Strip has become the focus of attack for Israel, which has vowed to annihilate the Islamist group's command structure and has told civilians to flee to the south. Meanwhile, spokesperson for the armed wing of Hamas has said, quote-unquote, your soldiers will return in black bags. Israel says it has lost 18 soldiers and has killed dozens of militants since the ground operations expanded. However, Hamas claims that Israel's death toll in Gaza is much higher than the military announced. And this comes as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken heads to Israel, where he's expected to push for temporary pauses in the fighting to allow for captive negotiations and aid deliveries.
We are determined to prevent escalation on any of these fronts, whether it's Lebanon, northern Israel, southern Lebanon, whether it's the West Bank, whether it's anywhere else in the region.
Meanwhile, the U.S. House of Representatives have passed a Republican plan to provide $14 billion in aid to Israel and cut funding of the Internal Revenue Service. This comes despite Democrats' insistence that it has no future in the Senate and the White House's promise of a veto. This is the first major legislative action under new Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson. And for more on this, our correspondent Susan Teherani sends us this report from New York. Take a look.
The House late on Thursday passed a bill for billions of dollars in aid for Israel. However, they decided not to provide funding for Ukraine, border security, and other important national security matters. This bill was a first test for the new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, who decided to go with this narrower bill that the Democrats would not approve of, rather than a packaged bill that President Biden and his party supports. Ultimately, this legislation is dead on arrival in the Senate, and President Biden has said that he would veto it. Democrats and many Senate Republicans believe that the bill should include not only Ukraine, Taiwan, but border security as well. However, this bill that was passed by the Republican House majority also cuts funding for the IRS as well. Now, it's important to note that many Americans are weary of the IRS. They've also become weary of where their tax dollars are going when it comes to Ukraine. They've asked for more accountability, and they've voted many of these Republican representatives on Capitol Hill to go after these policies, and based on these policies, ultimately it will be Chuck Schumer in the Senate that will decide the next steps. Susan Teherani reporting from New York for WION World is One.